Hello again, and welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346. Today we're going to be talking about psychology as a science, specifically social psychology as a science. And psychology is considered generally a social science, but the roots of social psychology are in the natural sciences, are in more hard sciences, more scientific endeavors. So we've talked about that seeing is not necessarily believing, that there are a lot of maybe not obvious findings in social psychology. And that's because a lot of our perceptual systems are biased, are limited, or distorted in some way. What we know to be true oftentimes can be completely false, such as the birds of a feather versus opposites attract argument. Another example of this would be if you've ever watched a football game, if you're following a specific team, and maybe you've sat in a room with a person following the other team. Both of you can watch the exact same play, especially if it's maybe a bad call by the referee, and see two completely different things. We are observing the exact same behavior and interpreting it in very biased and distorted ways. So it's important, especially when researching psychology, researching social psychology, to be able to objectively and systematically examine some of these phenomena that we're interested in. When we don't do this, that's what's known as pseudoscience or pseudopsychology in the case of psychology. There can also be, for example, instances of pseudoscience in other forms of science, such as astronomy. For astrology is a pseudoscience of astronomy, and alchemy is a pseudoscience of chemistry. But in terms of pseudopsychology, many of these theories can't be disproven. So ESP, or extrasensory perception, is one example of this. There was a time when repressed memories were a big deal and they couldn't be disproven, so they kind of ran rampant through some clinical and counseling psychologists. And my favorite would be the idea of the homunculus, that there is a tiny little person in everyone's brain who runs everything, makes all the decisions, behaviors, thoughts, feelings, etc. But we can't see him because anytime we try to see him, anytime maybe we cut into the brain, the homunculus, the little man, disappears. So we can't possibly see him, but trust me, he exists in there. He's running the show. So this is an example of something that can't be disproven, and we don't have the technology to disprove it. So this would be pseudoscience. This is not real science. So in terms of research that is conducted in terms of actual science in psychology, it's important not only to operationally define the variables that we're interested in or the phenomenon that we're interested in. So that's kind of defining a variable stated in terms of concrete observable procedures or observable terms, needing to be as objective as possible. And it's also important to have hypotheses about our certain theories or understandings of how and why people interact with each other. And hypotheses are testable predictions about how people will respond under certain conditions or situations. And hypotheses are especially important because there's a need for replicability, for replicating certain phenomena, certain tests, and tests need to be falsifiable. And we may have a certain hypothesis, but if it can't be disproven, then our hypothesis really isn't that helpful to us. We need to have a hypothesis where we can have results that could support the hypothesis and also results that could not support the hypothesis. We need to have those two options available in any given examination of a specific social psychological phenomenon. Another important consideration to think of is validity. There are different types of validity that we need to consider when conducting an experiment, when thinking scientifically about social psychology. Construct validity asks the question, is your test measuring what it's supposed to? Is the specific questionnaire that you have to measure depression, for example, actually measuring depression? And is it measuring depression in a similar way as other tests, so that if we did give the same person another test of depression, that they would show similar levels of depression as our test? So basically, are we measuring depression as we want to measure it? Is our construct that we're examining valid? Another type of validity is internal validity. And basically this asks the question, is what we're manipulating the only thing that could have an influence on our specific variable that we're interested in? Is the IV, independent variable, the only influence on the dependent variable, or the DV? So for example, if we're manipulating emotions of participants, if we want them to be happy or sad. Is the emotion of the participant the only thing that could lead to, for example, better or worse math scores? Or maybe are there extraneous variables such as the lighting in the room, or maybe the mood that they brought into the experiment in the first place? Could those be having an influence? So making sure that the IV is the only thing that could influence the DV has great internal validity. And lastly, we have external validity. Basically, is the test that we have, is the experiment that we're running applicable to the real world? Are we able to apply this to real world situations? Is the experience that we're finding meaningful? So for example, if a person is interacting with another individual in a lab setting, will they actually interact with that person in the same way in a different environment in the real world? If we have people perform specific gambles or maybe play a hand of poker in a lab, will people react in the same way to a specific poker hand in the real world as they would in a lab setting? So if that is the case, if we see similarities between lab settings and real world settings, then the study has great external validity. And lastly, it's important to think about when we talk about the differences between lab settings and real world settings. There are different types of research that exist within social psychology. Most research that we're going to be talking about is known as basic research. Research that is conducted in a university setting and is basically seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So we want to understand how people interact with each other, and we want to build on the knowledge that we already have. We want to just understand as much as possible about human interaction. Alternatively, we can have more applied research. That is basically seeking knowledge for a purpose, for more practical significance. That is applying the knowledge that we're acquiring to real life situations. We may want to better understand how people perceive colors in order to design a specific type of packaging for a new product that we have. And as you can imagine, more applied research is conducted in more business settings, settings in which they can actually use that information to build a better product. So that's all we have for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you all later. Bye.